Over to Kyra. Kyra, there you are.
Hi, I'm Kyra and I'm a Delhibird. How does the bar-tailed Godwit fly more than 12,000 kilometers non-stop? How does a barn swallow, having flown 10,000 kilometers, return to the exact same nest as the previous year? Let's unveil the marvels and mysteries of bird migration with Mike Uncle. Mike Uncle is a long-distance migrant familiar to Indian birders from his birding around Delhi in the early 2000s and around Bangalore. In recent years, he has keen interest in bird recording, especially related to migration. He has previously worked for British Trust for Ornithology and Bird Count India. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyra. That was a very lovely introduction. Thank you so much. Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you, Kyra. This must be the best introduction I've ever had, I think. Okay, I guess we can probably give a couple minutes before we start. So as a quick test for people as they're waiting to join, let me just share my screen a moment, and you can use the chat box to answer this little question I'm going to give you in a minute. Okay, can everyone see the little advert that went out earlier? Hopefully you can. Not yet, you can't. Okay. Okay, so you should be able to see there was a map on the little advert we put out earlier, which shows some tracks of a certain species. So as people are joining, use the chat box if you can to tell me what species that is. It's quite an interesting route, and I'll talk about that bird a little bit later on. But just have a few seconds whilst people are joining to tell me what the species is that's tracked on that map. Okay, great to see we've got a lot of participants joining, and looks like we've got participants from various places in the world as well, which is nice for a talk about migration, and it's very appropriate. Okay. Well, I think that's probably long enough. Just anyone who's just joined, if you want to use the chat box to tell me what species is shown in that map on screen, and we'll go into that one, and the answer will be a little bit later. Anyway, I think we're probably okay to start. So let me just start up presentation for you. Okay, so bird migration for dummies. Now, clearly bird migration is an enormous topic. What I'll do is go for a bit of an introduction and try and take you through some of the aspects of bird migration, and then talk about a few specific species, particularly ones that have some interest to us here in India. Now, most of these species are probably worth a webinar on their own. So be prepared that I might go and talk for quite a long time. What I suggest you do, if it's a bit too much, is drop out and watch me on YouTube later, where you can turn me on double speed. That'll be much better. One other thing also, although I won't be paying attention to the chat box as we go through, do send any questions there, and we can maybe run through some at the end, or do follow up if there is lots of questions there. Okay, so let's get started. So bird migration. Bird migration is really, like, I think, one of the biggest miracles of the natural world. And for me, it's the most exciting thing about birds. And it's probably what got me most interested in birds and bird watching in the first place. There are billions of birds flying each year. Now, how we know how many is interesting, but I know there's been figures such as, I think, 4 to 5 billion thought to be birds leave North America for South America every year. Somewhere between 2 and 6 billion fly from Europe to Africa. So there really are billions of birds that are migrating. And on some of that, there's some pretty amazing stories. As Kyra introduced, an Arctic tern is one of them. Flies the equivalent of the distance around the Earth every year. Bar-tailed Godwit does 12,000 kilometers in a non-stop journey. Ruby-throated Hummingbird we'll talk about in a little bit, barn swallows that we're all familiar with. So I got interested in bird migration, I think, as a child when I was first birdwing. And in England, we were lucky because all year round, migration plays a part. Every month is different with birds that are coming and going. Not quite as lucky in parts of India, although we do see some fantastic migration around. But for example, in my last 10 days, 2 weeks here in lockdown, I haven't actually seen a migrant species. But anyway, it really is the most fantastic topic. So we'll have a quick history of migration. Try not to take you through too much of that, but there's a few interesting snippets from the past, even going back 3,000 years. So in ancient Greece, Aristotle wrote quite a lot about the natural world generally, but we start with Homer's Iliad. They noticed that cranes leave each winter. Don't know where they go, but it was assumed that they go for war with the pygmies. And so every year the cranes would disappear, going off fighting the pygmy men, as they do in this picture. And then the pygmies would live on crane meat and eggs for a few months. And in fact, this was believed for like quite a long time, 4th century BC. There's a famous Roman naturalist called Pliny the Elder who repeated this. Anyway, Aristotle noted quite a few interesting things when he wrote. He noted that some birds were leaving, and he even noted the dates of the departure for some species: pelicans, geese, quail, swallows. He'd also noticed that strangely, as one species leave, another one would arrive. And very astutely, he noticed that birds that left were actually fatter, and those that returned seemed to be thinner. He noticed that birds that are higher up seem to move lower down. And this is pretty amazing when you think there's very little travel, so we wouldn't see birds elsewhere. He thought that birds either transform into other birds, or hibernate, or maybe migrate to far off lands. That one he considered the most absurd theory, and assumed that the transformation was likely. In particular, for one example, summer redstarts, which in Greece is a common redstart, we don't get in India, change into robins for the winter. You can actually understand this a little bit. This picture is a juvenile robin. You can see it's molting, so maybe it does transform into a different species. And the other conclusion he had was that swallows, for example, hibernate in holes or crevices. So that latter one was also thought for quite a long time. Here's another interesting story from the past, 12th century. So we're moving on a bit. This is Bishop Gerald of Wales. Barnacle geese were known to never be seen in the summer, and they never saw young barnacle geese either. They only saw adults. So his conclusion was that they actually grow like this. They hung down by their beaks as if they were a seaweed attached to the timber and surrounded by shells in order to grow more freely. Some of you might recognize this as a goose barnacle. It looks like a strange shell where he assumed and that these birds were living in there and would hatch in the autumn. In fact, this was a 15th century was still repeated, this story of goose barnacles. Okay, moving on. Swallows hibernating. This is 16th century. Swedish bishop Olaus Magnus described swarms of swallows going into winter in the soft mud of shallow rivers and lakes and emerging after the ice melts. So scientists at the time naturally tried to prove this. And they locked swallows in ice houses in the autumn. It seems that they all died. And a French ornithologist also tried to keep birds in an aviary and giving them everything they need to try and make them hibernate. But I think they always got a bit restless in the autumn and didn't hibernate. So there's another quite astute scientist from this time from the 17th century, Charles Morton in England. So he noted winter birds that breed not here as woodcock, snipe, etc. And to the summer, birds that breed here as nightingale and cuckoo. So he noted that some birds are here in the summer, some birds are here in the winter. Also, that birds had an instinct whereby they noticed changes of the air, the alteration of their daily food. So he noticed birds eating different food at certain times of year. He dismissed the swallows in the mud by suggesting that the cold temperature and the lack of air made it impossible. Quite astute there, I think. Okay. and also thought they're actually a good flyer, so they could go a long way. It is but a small journey for that swift flyer. It's probable they come from such a distance. So he was quite astute with his observations. However, he wasn't quite as on target with his conclusion. Whither should these creatures go, unless it were to the moon, he thought. So, they don't actually go to the moon. He did calculate that they would take 60 days to get there, flying at 125 miles an hour. Anyway, moving on, we know a little bit more about migration now, but it's actually surprising that there's a heck of a lot we still don't know. So we should really start with what migration actually is. So the word migrare from a Latin word means to change or to go away. And so with migration, we really mean birds moving from one area to another with a specific purpose. And that's quite a broad definition. What it does exclude would be things like daily movements, seasonal. So things like flying from a roost in the morning and back in the evening, flying from where birds are roosting to a feeding area. We don't tend to treat that as migration. But there are lots of different types of migration. So why do birds migrate? Well, the driver that we're talking about is survival. As with any creature, the main instinct is to survive. So migration enhances their chance of survival by moving from somewhere with low resources to an area of better resources. And when we talk resources, we're basically talking food mainly and nesting locations. So migration is with birds moving from one area to another, particularly relating to feeding and nesting. Okay, worth going through a few definitions first. Obvious one, a migrant is a bird that migrates. So the opposite of that is resident or sedentary. So the birds that remain in one area all year round. A summer migrant, so when we talk about a bird that is a summer migrant, is a bird that visits for the summer, which as I mentioned is typically to breed. And then it's doing that on its summering grounds or breeding grounds. A winter migrant, obviously, is the opposite. So it's a bird that visits an area for the winter. And then lots of birds that don't stay are passage migrants. So this is a bird that's migrating from its wintering grounds to its breeding grounds, but does not stay in this particular area. It just passes through. And regarding migration, we tend to refer to outward migration as the journey after breeding to the wintering grounds. If you think of a bird is born on the breeding grounds, so its first journey, we talk about the outward journey from its home, which is going to the breeding grounds, and then return migration is it when it comes back to the breeding grounds. And it's interesting that you note on an outward migration, a juvenile bird will not have done it before. It will not know the route at all. There's a couple of other definitions that are worth covering, particularly in India, where they get confused quite a lot. So over-summering is a term we use sometimes. And what that refers to is a bird that remains on its wintering grounds during the summer. So it stays during the summer, over the summer period. It's interesting, but in India, a lot of people get that the other way around and talk about overwintering, meaning over the winter or beyond the winter. So a wader, for example, in June, they might refer to overwintering, but it's not, it's over-summering. And we see that in a few birds. So you might see is waders, a lot of first-year birds don't bother migrating in their first year. They only breed in their second year or older, so they might stay on their wintering grounds during the summer. So in India, we get some records maybe of green shank or Pacific golden plover or something like that in June. Quite often, those will be over-summering birds, maybe young birds. Also, injured birds may not make the journey. Ducks, another one, you may see ducks in the summer that you don't expect to be there. Overwintering, again, a similar thing, these birds that have stayed on their breeding grounds or maybe passage areas during the winter. You might see that sometimes with rare birds. So if you find a rare bird in the autumn, turns up in India, and it stays through the winter, maybe it's decided it's out, it's off place, it's gone off its normal route, and it just decides to stay, it may overwinter. So why do birds migrate? Well, this fantastic animation that is done by Madhu recently illustrates this a little bit. As I said, birds are migrating effectively to enhance their chance of survival. They want food in order to be able to raise young most successfully. Now, in the northern hemisphere, at least most birds migrate north in the spring, and they do this because food is plentiful. There's more plant growth, there's flowers are blooming, there's seeds and fruits ripening, there's huge numbers of insect populations. And you can see from the animation the vegetation growth in north of India through Central Asia, through Siberia, through the taiga and the tundra. And I think this map helps illustrate just how enormous that area is. If you think of birds throughout India have wintered here, but what a huge area it is north that's becoming available, becoming plentiful for food, and becoming an opportunity to take advantage of. There's also longer daylight hours there, so we can feed much more, can forage all the time. In fact, if we go furthest north into the tundra, we have 24 hours daylight, so we can feed all the time. And there's studies shown that some birds have been able to raise more young in the longer daylight and the longer feeding they have. There's also more nesting locations, would be one other thing. Probably less predators, especially in the far north for ground nesting birds, which otherwise are very subject to predation. And in the very far north here, of course, we've got permafrost that's melted, so we've actually got much more land, therefore much more food, much more nesting locations becoming available. So it makes sense to try and take advantage of this. One point actually is worth mentioning is that migration, we talk about birds migrating because it's too cold, and it's not really. It's an indirectly it's too cold, but it's really food is the driver in this case. So why bother migrating? There's food in the winter. Come to India, winter in India, eating is not a problem. Plenty of food around. So why don't birds just stay here? Why do they take this arduous journey and migrate? Well, there's probably a few reasons. One is that during the breeding season, the demand is much higher. Birds are breeding, they've got young to feed. There is much more food required. So competition for food is likely to be a problem. Similarly, competition for nest sites is going to be a problem. If birds are to stay in a smaller area, they'll probably concentrate predators a little bit more. So spreading out makes more sense. And same thing applies for disease, really, and parasites. Concentrating in one area will lessen the chance of a disease spreading through the entire population, for example. So when we talk about migration, the main type of migration that we all think of would be the seasonal round-trip migration. This is birds traveling from the wintering grounds, typically in the south, to the breeding grounds in the north, often going to exactly the same sites, breeding and wintering, that they did the year before, which is something that's known as site fidelity. I'm sure many of you noticed this. Here in India, we're not much of a breeding area for birds, we're mostly a wintering area, but birds such as Blythe's reed warbler tend to be very faithful to a small area and come back year after year. Grey wagtail, which is shown here as a bird on its breeding grounds, but in the winter they can come back to very small territories in the same area. In fact, in Karnataka here a few years ago, in Bihar Hills, there was a famous grey wagtail because it had one leg, so it was easily recognizable. And that returned to the exact same patch in Bihar Hills at least 3 winters running, having done a breeding trip at least to the Himalayas in India, if not further. Now, birds on these migration from north to south in the autumn may often take a different route in the spring compared to the autumn. There's a feature known as loop migration, taking advantage of, for example, different winds, different climate, that sort of thing. A lot of seabirds use this, using winds and currents. They'll take a different route. See it in shorebirds quite a lot. We potentially see it in India in some passerines, which take a more westerly route in the spring compared to the east. Spring waders, for example, there's a lot of waders you see in the spring. So northwest India would be a good example, places like Delhi. We see waders in breeding plumage at this time of year that are going inland, and they're probably making just a more direct route to their breeding grounds than they might in the autumn. Most of migration that we talk about is north to south, latitudinal direction, but there is some going which goes west to east. In Asia, things like I think a lot of the warblers actually move through Eastern Asia. They move north first and then they spread west. But typically the general direction is north-south. We'll come on to a few interesting non-direct north-south birds a little bit later. So another type of migration, now not quite as well understood or known, is altitudinal migration. So it's similar to seasonal migration in that birds are moving for lack of resources, food typically, but this time the movement is mostly altitudinal, so coming down from the mountains into lower areas. For example, harsh weather has made deep snowfall in the mountains, meaning food is more difficult to find, so birds move to the lower elevations. Now this might be very short distance, so pheasants are altitudinal migrants. In the Himalayas, maybe they descend 1,000 meters. Doesn't sound very much when we're talking about our Arctic terns and our bar-tailed Godwits doing 10,000 kilometers and more. But in altitude, it can make a big difference for habitat and weather conditions and consequently food. So birds such as the wall creeper, which again, thankfully in North India, we're quite familiar with in the lowlands because they come down right down into the plains even in the winter. In the summer, they bred on mountain cliff faces. They're known to breed as high as 6,300 meters in the Himalayas, really very, very high. But they're winter down in the plains. And they might just have traveled, say, 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers. But clearly, wintering at 6,000 meters, they're not going to be able to find food. There's various other examples. So brown dipper would be one, spotted forktail. Some interesting ones such as spectacled finch and other finches which do this, rose finches. The grey wagtail that I just talked about is an altitudinal migrant as well. Now these sort of movements aren't generally as well studied. They're not quite as obvious to us necessarily, or we don't have so much data on them. It's one thing to note for those people who do record observations regularly, that if you're birding in the hills, it's very important to record birds at the right altitude. So we know this sort of thing. So for example, if you're using eBird, make sure you record birds at the correct altitude and don't go 1,000 meters up and still use the same list. We can actually get quite a lot of data of where birds are with the more accurate locations that are plotted on lists. Okay, migration is not that simple. Is all birds moving south or all birds moving down? In that, what about cormorants, great cormorants? They fly around in India, they move, they're not here all the year. Where do they go? What do they do? But in places they are resident. So great cormorant is probably a partial migrant. So in February, I was in Himachal Pradesh and a couple of times in the mountains at sort of 2,000, 2,500 meters, saw a flock of 100 great cormorants flying over in a particular way. Where are they going? Do they migrate to Central Asia? Do they breed there? There weren't any large wetlands in that area. So great cormorant is a migrant in parts, but we don't really know that much about it. Common coot is clearly a migrant. We get thousands and thousands in the winter, but it also breeds in many places in India. Pied cuckoo. We have pied cuckoos resident in South India all year round, but we also have a lot more in the summer. We'll come on to those a little bit later, but black-winged stilt, I think, is probably another one. They breed here, but we get a lot more in the winter. So partial migration is when some individuals of the species migrate, but some are resident. And there are some extreme species which have a population of which might be resident in one part of their range, migrants in others, and then partial migrants in between. And when we're talking about this, we're not really talking subspecies necessarily here. We're talking same subspecies as well, breed in the same area at the same times. You wouldn't know the difference looking at them, but you can tell because their migratory behavior is different. There's one interesting one in India, actually, which is Satyr tragapan is known to be a partial migrant. They don't migrate very far, they migrate probably a few kilometers, but some populations don't move at all, and some move a few kilometers for the winter and back again in the spring. So common starling, another one, crows even, maybe partial migrants. There's a lot to study on this. The other thing about this is it's thought that maybe this is an evolutionary crossroads, I've said here, is what's more successful? Is it being resident or is it migrating? So over time, maybe the migrant populations survive better. Maybe the weather gets harsher, the resident populations struggle more. So it might be more sensible to have one particular strategy. Okay, differential migration. So birds, although we think of like flocks, big flocks of geese, cranes and things like that, most birds don't migrate in family groups or fixed flocks. And often adults and immatures migrate separately. Males and females migrate separately. So particular species which exhibit different migratory behavior are known as differential migrants. And the sort of ways this comes forward are young birds may leave earlier or later than their parents. Typically later. The parents have finished their breeding duties, may leave first, and the juveniles may leave later. Similar thing happens with males and females. Males are finished earlier, females are still busy feeding the young, males may migrate earlier. In the spring, males often arrive earlier on the breeding grounds, the desire to set up a territory and attract the best mate. So these are all forms of differential migrations. And they may take different routes as well, and have different wintering areas. So I don't know if you noticed, but with certain species, you see more females than males, or you see more immatures than males. Harriers, one type, Pallid Montagu's harriers, even marsh harriers. You typically see more females, especially in the south of India, than you do of males. Common potchard, the duck, that often males and females migrate separately. Pintail do as well. So we don't necessarily know in India what many of these species do, but it's something that ordinary bird watchers can actually help solve. If you've got a flock of ducks in the winter on your local areas, can you work out how many are male and female? It's generally difficult to do in the autumn. You can't tell so easily because in eclipse plumage, males look very similar to females. But in the later in the winter and the spring, it's easy to tell the male and female pintail. So maybe when you see that flock of 500 pintail on your local lake, you could count them and find out whether there's 400 males or more and less females. Another form of migration, which is slightly different, which is molt migration. So most birds will molt before they migrate so that their feathers are in the best condition for the journey. Some birds wait and molt on their wintering grounds when they've got more time to migrate. But there's a few species, and this is particularly wildfowl, ducks and geese, that migrate to a particular place purely for molting. And this is called molt migration. So ruddy shell ducks are pictured here, which is a molt migrant. Most ducks actually are. But what they'll do is birds from various areas will all head to particular sites and molt in a rapid molt where they typically lose all their flight feathers together, so they can't fly for a few weeks. So these particular sites, which are used year after year, need to be very safe, secure from predators, as birds can't fly. And then post the molt, birds will usually return to their regular areas, which might not be a step on the way to migration. It might be back to where they came from, particularly. So these are molt migrants. There's a very famous one in Europe with common shell ducks, where there's known to be about 100,000 or more common shell ducks from all across Northwest Europe migrate to the Wadensee in Germany in July or August. And they're there for several months, maybe until December or January even. And for a few weeks of that, they are completely flightless. So in India, we probably have the same thing. Ruddy shell ducks may have favoured molt migration sites. I don't know whether we know that at all. I know in Nepal, Kosi Barrage used to get large flocks of ruddy shell ducks. Further west in Turkey, they get very large flocks in the autumn. There's other birds. Coot is another molt migrant. So maybe in July, August, September time, there are wetland areas that are extremely important in India for molt migrants. There's very little known about it as well, but actually there are some passerines known to do molt migrations, maybe shorter distances, but maybe they head to areas which are particularly good feeding. They molt faster and spend a few weeks in these areas before migrating. Dispersal is sometimes not thought of as quite the same as a migration, but it is really. It's still a seasonal activity. It's still predictable, but it only refers to young birds. So dispersal is young birds left the care of their parents, and they've wandered out of the territory for a few weeks or months typically. So dispersal is usually known as post-juvenile dispersal. So it's usually short distance. Sometimes they'll gather with flocks of other juveniles. And this could happen with the house sparrows breeding in your garden, if you're lucky enough to have any. The young spread out to find a new territory, but in the autumn they'll disperse from the parents' territory. There's a few well-known ones. Black-crowned night heron, for example, that's a common dispersing migrant, and it's known to go more than 1,000 kilometers. Immatures will do that in the autumn. Little egret that's pictured here. In the UK, for example, little egret used to be a very rare bird. I saw my first one in 1989, when it was quite a twitch at the time. But most of the birds then were juveniles, and this was a dispersal, but in very large numbers after a presumably successful breeding season. And what happened then is a lot of those stayed on and started breeding, and that was really the biggest start in colonization of the UK by little egrets. Little egret now is a very common bird. It's commoner than grey heron, so it's the commonest heron in Britain. But it wasn't that case 30 years ago, certainly. There's another dispersal which we see a little bit in India, monsoon dispersal. So there are birds that, due to the monsoon rains, start to do summer movements, and these aren't really very well understood. But in Bangalore, we see some of this as well. One example is crimson-backed sunbird. I've seen crimson-backed sunbird probably in 6 or 7 years in the time I've lived in Bangalore, always in July and August. And the rest of the time they're in the Western Ghats. You wouldn't think they're birds that migrate very far, but they do disperse in the monsoon. And there's other Western Ghats birds that do this as well. So Malabar whistling thrush is certainly known to travel a bit in this time of year. Brown-backed needletails will appear in other places a bit further away from the Western Ghats. So nomadic migrants, like me, are a bit more unusual. They're birds that do a one-way movement. So birds that migrate, they move one way, they settle in that new area, and then they breed there, and they don't typically return to their original location. As you'd expect from that, it's quite unpredictable. So it typically would happen based on food availability. So specialist feeders in particular, if the crop of their specialist food is poor in an area, will make nomadic movements to an area where they can find better food. And red crossbill is probably the most popular example of this. Certainly in Europe, it feeds mainly of spruce seeds. Spruce is not a predictable, dependable crop. So some years they move to new areas and will turn up. And interestingly, they can breed at just a few months old. So something they've taken advantage of here. The conditions for breeding might be erratic themselves, so they can actually breed very early. So you see birds still in juvenile plumage. The males won't have any of their red colour, and they'll breed as a nomadic migrant. Whether the red crossbills that we get in parts of India do this or not, I don't know. It'll be interesting to study them and look at when sightings are typically and when breeding records are in particular. So most of the areas where you commonly see nomadic migrants are deserts. So Australia has quite a few desert migrants, honey eaters following their particular blossoms. They're like budgerigars, are a nomadic migrant. One quite famous one in India a few years ago, which is the bird that's pictured here, is a pale rock sparrow. It wasn't recorded in India until 2012. And then typically in Kutch, in Gujarat, and some in Rajasthan, there were flocks that appeared, flocks of hundreds in places. And for a few months, I believe they were present, although there haven't been any breeding records since, so they haven't actually settled to breed. But there have been a few records of pale rock sparrows in subsequent years, so maybe birds that did stay on. Maybe they are breeding somewhere. There hasn't been another nomadic invasion, but it's exciting if it does happen. So also exciting for migrants and for bird watchers are eruptions. And these are a bit similar to nomadic migrants, but in this case, they're not birds that will settle to breed, they usually return to the usual breeding sites, but they're unpredictable. They don't happen every year. There might be several years where birds are resident, don't move hardly at all, and then suddenly have a year where they erupt. They appear in large numbers in places where they were not there normally. Again, it's probably food related, but in particular, it's thought that it might be a combination of their breeding success and food. So in an average year, breeding might be better than in some years, it'll be worse in other years, but generally the birds will survive, they won't migrate differently, they'll cope with these fluctuations. But if they had a year, for example, of very successful breeding, which coincided with a year where the weather was very bad and food wasn't available very much, then they'll move, they'll migrate. And so these are eruptions. So the sorts of species tend to be quite exciting species for bird watchers. So nutcrackers in Europe in particular, and I don't know in India if we start to get nutcrackers in unusual areas at all. Pallas's sandgrouse is a really familiar one that hasn't erupted for 50 or 60 years, I think, and people in mostly Europe will be very excited when the next eruption happens. Waxwings is an eruptive species. So in India, in 2017, in Lahore, in Himachal Pradesh, there was a flock of waxwings recorded. The first ones in India for more than 100 years, I think. And these are eruptive birds. And interestingly, 2016-17, the winter, when the birds turned up in India, was a waxwing winter in Europe. So in the UK, it was the largest population of waxwings in the winter for 4 years, where we do get every few years waxwing invasions. Brambling is again another one, so some of the finches are also eruptive birds. One interesting one in India, short-eared owl, like some of the other owls which erupt. So in Northern Europe, these birds are very dependent on voles and lemmings for their food. And populations of voles and lemmings fluctuate dramatically. So every 4 years, there's typically a big crash. And then that forces birds that feed on them out of their normal range. So I don't know, with short-eared owls, we get them right down into southern India, they go right down to the tip. Does that mean years when we do get them there are poor lemming years and they've been forced to come down here? Do we see more some years than other years? Again, as with many things in India, I don't know. It'd be interesting to have a look at some of the data if we have it, see whether that is the case. And of course, non-migrants are residents. And for residents, you think life should be quite easy, really. There's none of this energy they need compared to migrants. You can spend all your time feeding, defending your territory, looking out for predators, raising young. All these tasks are important for survival when you don't need to migrate. And interesting, there's a few things that residents differ from slightly in migrants a little bit, in that a lot of resident birds could change their diet regularly. So insect eaters in the spring might be forced to eat more buds and berries in the summer, seeds in the autumn, maybe eat fruits and nuts in the winter. So they need to adapt to food availability year round. Some of these residents will store food. So jays, for example, well-known nuthatches for storing food. So again, to protect themselves in the winter when food is less available, they'll store food sometimes. They can be more aggressive, dominant birds. Crows, for example, may be. And you might find that some of these resident birds, if the weather is harsh and they get used to it, will roost together. So they'll roost very tightly in flocks. So you see that a bit with bulbuls and things like that. And it'll be interesting are they doing that more in colder weather? Even for feeding, then they will also flock together. So in the autumn, you'll see flocks of warblers. So in the Himalayas, for example, flocks of warblers and tits gathering together and moving through to feed together. Now, these might include some migrants, but also many resident species. So that's what migration is. Those are some of the different types of migrants. How do they do it? And this is where it can get very complicated. So I'll try not to go into quite so much detail, but birds need to prepare for migration. There are three main things in a bird's year that really sap their energy. And that's molting, that's breeding, and it's migration. And these three things are known to be driven by their annual cycles. There is instinct that tells them when, more or less, to do these things. And it's thought that changes in day length the birds detect are the main trigger. So they know roughly from the day length change when they should be starting molting, when they should be moving to migrate. So it's not so much necessarily the actual weather at the time, although the weather does play a part, but it's more the day length that is the main trigger. And so typically we mentioned that birds breed, they finish breeding, so that's a major source of their effort done. They're going to migrate fairly shortly. They will then typically molt then, and they'll spend a few weeks molting, major molt, before they migrate. When they're actually migrating, as you'd expect, birds need a lot of energy. So as their molt is finishing and when they're preparing for departure, they need to build up fat reserves. So in migration, they're trying to feed off their fat reserves much more because they get the most energy from that. And so they'll start eating more before they migrate. And you can say that many birds more or less double their body weight in fat prior to migration. And you can see this if you're actually observing birds. It's probably easiest in the autumn. So for areas where you've had breeding migrants that are now looking to move to wintering areas. So you can see birds that are typically, they're feeding much more actively in the autumn. In fact, they're quite restless in their feeding. And there's a term hyperphagia used for this activity where they're constantly feeding more than they were before. You'll see that also with birds on migration, on stopovers in places as well. They may change their diet. So warblers, lesser whitethroat pictured here, may eat many more berries. That's partly because there are less insects around and more berries around, but they get more fat from that. And then interestingly, before they actually migrate, birds get restless. And there's a German term, Zugenruhe, used to describe this. And again, it's something you can note sometimes in the field, birds looking restless in migration. It's been studied in the labs a bit where migrant species, if they've been kept as cage birds, will start getting restless and flying from one side of the cage to another at the time when they would normally be expecting to be migrating. So, the more interesting questions and the more difficult questions to answer is how do birds find their way? Unfortunately, they don't have particular guides to point them out, as this crane does. But we know that they're going thousands of miles. They're returning to the same areas. So there's two aspects to finding their way, really. There's orientation, which is really knowing where you are and the direction you should be going from that. So it's a sort of approximate way of keeping on track, a bit like using a compass. And then there's navigation, which is actually related to finding a specific location. So how do you find that specific nest site that you were using last year? And that's clearly the much more accurate one here. Now, orientation is quite well studied, and there's quite a lot known about it in birds, but navigation is still majorly a mystery. So how does that swallow get back to its exact nest? And a lot of that we don't know. But yeah, I'm sure you'll have known some of the feats of homing, obviously homing pigeons, but there's been experiments done with other species like shearwaters. So Manx shearwaters, for example, have been taken from their breeding grounds in Western Britain, taken to North America and released, and they find their way home, find their way back to their breeding ground for some reason. Somehow they managed to do it. So clearly there's something instinctive here. So, as I said, there is some instinct here. Birds, they know which direction to go. You don't often see flocks of migrants going in the wrong way. They're usually going the right way. And lots of experiments have been done in labs with birds on this. Birds, for example, that have been hand-reared. They're provided with lots of food, but in their cages, they'll still try to migrate. So they'll still move to a particular direction in their cage during the autumn and during the spring again. So that's with no weather affecting them, no other birds affecting them. There has to be something instinctive to how they do that. Now, the sun is quite easy to use for orientation. We know where it rises, we know where it sets, we know that at noon in the northern hemisphere, it's due south and it's highest in the sky. And again, experiments with birds in cages have proven that they use the sun. So starlings, for example, have been put in cages and would move to the right place in the cage, would orient themselves in the same direction as wild migrant starlings if they were exposed to sunlight, but not if it was cloudy. And there's also experiments being done by altering the position of their fake sun, and it would alter their orientation. And similar experiments have been done on various birds by attempting to confuse their internal clocks by giving them artificial light, and they'll set off in the wrong direction according to how much they've been confused. But there's still things that we don't know about that. Is that like what happens when they reach the equator? The sun's position changes. So although we do understand a fair bit about orientation, it's not simple and understood. It's also thought that some birds may use smell even as an orientation mechanism. We know birds smell food quite easily, especially seabirds. They have strongly developed smell for some species, so maybe smell comes into it. Even sound is thought to be maybe used by some species. Birds can hear much lower sounds than humans, and so there's thought that maybe in places they hear the wind and they hear the sea, and may be able to use that. So sun is clearly important, but most birds actually migrate at night, so clearly it's no help then. So it's the star positions. Stars and movements of the stars is what birds learn from this. And it's important that actually they clearly do learn. So the interesting thing is birds that migrate at night are not necessarily nocturnal birds, they're diurnal birds. So how do they use the stars? They presumably, do they wake up in the night when they're normally roosting and learn positions of the stars? So the experiments have been done on birds in planetariums, and it's known that they recognize spots of light moving about a point. So the North Pole, the North Star, rather, they can detect that, and they can use that to orient, at least if it's not cloudy. So how do they manage on cloudy nights? They still manage to migrate. So there's no sun, there are no stars. So this is probably the biggest discovery with experiments on birds, was that birds can sense the Earth's magnetic field. They can tell from magnetic field lines, they can tell the angle of inclination. So they can tell their position roughly from this. So there are some information known about how they do this. There's no actual sort of organ in their body that does it, but it's known roughly that they have some adaptations so they can do this. But detecting the magnetic fields is thought to be very much the most important feature that birds use in order to be able to orient themselves properly. What about navigation though? So navigation, how do they find the exact location? This is where it gets very interesting. So you know that birds go the same route more or less from year to year, so they can learn it, but that doesn't help our juvenile cuckoo in its first migration, where it's never been before and it's not got a parent with it. So birds have thought that they can recognize landforms, so they recognize rivers, coastlines, local features, which may be part of the way they find their way back to the exact nest when they get roughly the area. So they probably do build up some kind of geographic map themselves. We know they can sense magnetic fields, so potentially they have their own way of determining location, latitude, longitude. They know the angle of inclination, they can work that out. Can they tell the direction, intensity of the magnetic field? So maybe therefore they can use, if you like, an internal grid system. Some birds clearly learn. Birds that fly in flocks can learn from birds that have done it before. But this is probably the biggest area of migration that's not so well understood, is how do birds find the exact same bush that they wintered in the year before? One interesting anecdote from this is talking about a geographic map. Homing pigeons are known in places to follow actual roads. So they clearly do recognize landmarks. They'll follow major roads to get to where they're going. And that includes even following bends in roads where an easy direct route would take them there faster. So we clearly know that birds do follow landmarks, so we can understand that they'll follow rivers in a similar way. So what about the actual journey then? So how far do birds go? So the Arctic tern we mentioned, the longest journey there is. Bar-tailed Godwit, we mentioned that again coming up, but that's the longest non-stop journey. But many, many more birds are short distance migrants. So some of these pheasants that we mentioned, or grouse, move very short distances. In fact, it's even some maybe just a few hundred meters. There's grouse that are known to breed in conifers and move to deciduous forest in the winter, but it's still a migration. What about penguins? Penguins migrate. They may not fly, but Adelaide penguins, for example, are known to migrate up to 13,000 kilometers per year. And that's walking along the edge of the ice so they keep against the open sea where they can feed. And these spectacular migrations, like the Bar-tailed Godwit, is actually an exception. So most birds migrate in stages and they'll stop. So they'll stop and they'll feed. It's known that some birds lose, I think it's 1% of their body weight for every hour of migration. So it's a huge toll it takes them. Therefore they need to stop and they'll feed. And they'll stop maybe for several weeks in good feeding areas. And what this means for conservation is that some of these feeding areas that birds are using on migration, maybe just for a few weeks, are absolutely vital. If those aren't there and the birds can't feed up, they're going to struggle to complete their journeys. And in fact, one of the prime examples in India, of course, would be Amur falcons in Nagaland. So the Doyang Reservoir in that area, the birds are only there for about 6 weeks, but they're stopping there, they're feeding on termites majorly. If that habitat disappeared, where are those going to do? How are those birds going to cope with that missing few weeks of vital refueling? So a little about speed of migration. Speed is not very important. It's a bit like when we're traveling somewhere. It's better to get there safely. So in the autumn, birds are really pretty slow. Typically barn swallows, about 3 months to migrate from Europe to Africa. Marsh warblers apparently are known to take 6 months over that migration. So half the year they've spent on their autumn migration. In the spring, they're typically faster. So they have an urge to get back to the breeding grounds. In fact, that's actually an interesting point for those people who like seeing rare birds. If you want to twitch something that's been seen, if it's in the spring, you better go quickly. It might not stay around. In the autumn, you've got a better chance that it might hang around for a few days. Actual flight speeds, I mentioned here a little bit. Swifts are not that swift. Waders and ducks fly much faster than swifts on typical migration. Passerines are saying about 30 to 50 kilometers an hour typically. So a car being driven on a like normal road here, similar sorts of speeds. Height. So how high do birds migrate at? It varies quite a lot. We've all heard the story about bar-headed geese crossing the summit of Mount Everest. Well, they do clearly cross the Himalayas, but it's very unlikely they actually went over the summit of Mount Everest. It's likely an urban myth, but I'll talk a little bit more about bar-headed geese coming in a little while. Hooper swans, for example, that have been recorded at 8,200 meters, not in migration, but in severe weather. So birds can migrate that high. Over the sea, they typically migrate much higher. But it's known from radar that 50% of small birds at least migrate less than 400 meters. So at night, in the spring or autumn, you think just above you, there are millions of small birds migrating, and they're only just above you. Most birds migrate by night. So these are not nocturnal birds, so it must be advantageous to migrate at night. And clearly, they're less likely to overheat. the air is cooler, it's less windy, there's fewer predators, so it makes a lot of sense for birds to migrate at night. But a lot of birds do migrate in the day. The typical birds that you get migrating in the day are raptors, so European honey buzzards that you can see here. Raptors, storks, pelicans, they use thermals, so they'll find pockets of hot air, rise like these birds are doing here on the thermals, and then glide and use very little energy in flight. So these are birds that can't really cross large bodies of water. They don't get thermals, you don't get thermals over water, so they look for land crossings and they'll fly in the daytime. Swallows and martins, they'll fly in the daytime mostly, probably because they're feeding en route. There are some other birds, so larks and finches are known to, some species certainly, and it's not really known why they would fly in the day when most fly at night. So particular routes I mentioned there, so the raptors and the pelicans, which need to avoid geographical barriers like big water bodies, birds that move around the Himalayas, for example, those we tend to funnel through smaller areas, and we call that as narrow front migration. Usually large birds that migrate at day, but by far the majority of birds cross on a broad front, so a wide area across the landscape. And we know something about some of the routes birds come up. So this is a map from BirdLife International. The Flyways concept started with tracking of waders and looking at some of the routes waders were doing. And it clearly doesn't mean birds all go in these directions, but it's identifying major areas of migration, which then helps identify sites that need to be conserved. Here in India, we're part of the Central Asian Flyway, which I can probably show you on the map if I get my pointer to work. So this is us, the Central Asian Flyway. It's actually the shortest of the flyways going out into India, and it has the barrier of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau, so it actually has fewer species than the others, but we still have quite a lot of this migration. Other ones that we have, India is also part of other flyways as well. So the East Asian Australasian Flyway, which is the green one that we have here. So that one in particular has the largest number of migratory water birds and a lot of threatened water birds. And we'll talk about that one a little bit more. The importance of these flyways is it helps identify some of the stopover sites in here. So in this East Asian Flyway, you have between China and Korea the Yellow Sea, which a lot of people will have heard of as a hugely important refueling stop for waders. In India too, we certainly have sites that are important for stopovers, so places like Bar-tailed, places like Chilka Lake, which attract large numbers of migrant birds. These are vital, and the flyways is one way we use to identify these areas that need particular conservation. So these are the stopover sites. So migrants are staying here for a few weeks, maybe a few months, and then moving on. So they're vital for refueling. And migrants will certainly travel not necessarily directly from their breeding grounds to their wintering grounds, but they'll take a longer route to visit stopover sites. Doyang Reservoir I mentioned before for the Amur falcons, mentioned the Yellow Sea, but various other wetlands in China, Thailand, Myanmar are extremely vitally important for spoon-billed sandpiper, for example. So if some of these wetlands in Myanmar and Thailand were to disappear, the extremely threatened spoon-billed sandpiper may well disappear too. Yeah. So migration is obviously pretty tough. Birds get exhausted. Maybe they didn't prepare well enough before migration. Maybe the weather was very bad en route. Maybe they overheated. They didn't have enough energy to keep going. They were forced to land in somewhere where conditions weren't good for landing. Maybe some of these staging sites, these stopovers, were not there. The habitat had been destroyed. They could starve to death. Collisions with buildings is one of the major causes of death of migrant birds, in particular artificial light. So we've seen that birds are migrating at night. They can be disoriented by artificial light. It's reckoned that 1 billion birds die every year in the US by coming into collision with buildings. Predators en route, obviously. Cats in the US, again, is by far the biggest predator, but birds of prey in places en route, bats even. Disease can be a problem in some of these places, especially at a stopover site, for example, where in fact birds are not social distancing at the stopover site, and then they're traveling on further and spreading disease. Pollution in these places. Weather is obviously a hazard if they get caught in unusual weather conditions. Strong winds, fog, no cloud to disorientate them, natural disasters as well, and hunting is unfortunately a major problem in places. In the Mediterranean, between Africa and Eurasia, we've heard stories of Cyprus and Malta and Lebanon and places like that. You saw on that route 25 million birds are killed each year unlawfully. Hammer falcons we'll talk about a little bit more, yellow-breasted buntings in Asia. So it sounds pretty risky, migration, but clearly it works. It's evolved and birds are doing this, so it must be an overall sensible strategy. But it's quite interesting, I think, looking at the challenges of how many of those are man-made, or at least majorly caused by man. How do we study migration? Well, most of what we know about migration is from bird ringing. How long birds live, where they go. It's fine for me watching birds here to see my Blythe-reed warbler that I saw in the garden, and my friend who lives in Sweden a month later will have one in his garden. Just observers can't tell whether that's the same bird. We deal at species level. Ringing can tell us that, and has done with various things. So ringing has been vital for that. The image at the bottom here is of a bird being checked for fat. It's a way of checking to see how much fat is stored under the skin, and that's important, that ringers can determine how much fat birds are carrying, how well prepared are they for their journey. And these can help, we can then help identify sites on migratory routes that are the key for conservation. So ringing has been what's told us almost everything we know about migration. Now, especially in recent years, expanding on that, tagging and tracking. And this is where some of the really exciting stories come in. Color marking is the simplest way of tagging something. Spoon-billed sandpiper here, marked with its flag on its ring. So what that means is the bird doesn't need to be retrapped. You could be, if you're very lucky, somewhere in West Bengal scanning over some mudflats and see a bird with a flag on its ring like this. You know where it is. And the BNHS do lots of colour tagging of waders in particular in India. But some of the more fun tracking methods are geolocators, which are little light gathering devices that are very light. In fact, I think some of them are just over a gram now. And they can be attached to a bird and they record light levels every few minutes. And by recording light levels, we give them an idea of location. So geolocators have transformed what we know about birds in some of these ways. Satellite tracking is a bit more advanced than that, and we know exact positions of birds. So this cuckoo, for example, is fitted with a satellite tag. This is the antenna. We'll talk about cuckoos in a bit. So satellite tracking, for example, identified that sociable lapwings move from Kazakhstan through the Middle East, and they stage in places which weren't known to stage. And the populations where they were staging were actually larger than the known global population of the species. So this is some of the importance of satellite tagging. Radar is a fun way. I'm not sure that in India we'd be allowed to get our hands on weather radar quite like this. But this is, in the US, this is the weather radar. And the high intensity areas here are a lot of birds moving. So this is actually live detecting birds migrating. And this is being used now to send out alerts to particular areas of high migration to turn lights out. The lights out turn the lights out in large buildings. And one of the fun ways you can use this, if you combine these migration radar, and you combine what you know of birds from eBird, for example, is actually to forecast migration. So this was a forecast produced about 5 days ago, looking at 2 nights ago, and what they thought would be the migration. And I forget how many birds they were saying, but it's something like, I think they were saying about 300 or 400 million birds were thought to be migrating on this night. So how can we observe migration? Now, you can probably see on the screen here a few little dots flying past. Those are warblers. You can count them if you like. They're going through quite quickly, a few going through every second. So observing nocturnal birds is obviously a bit difficult, but birds continue migrating after sunrise sometimes, like they are here, and weather conditions can make them migrate a little bit later. And there are hotspots, particularly coastal areas or inland or following hill ridges and things like that, which funnel migrants. So visible migration is a fantastic thing to watch. If you think of all these birds, tiny birds that are flying along here. I'd say most of the birds are nocturnal. There's something called knock-mig. It's happening a lot in Europe now, particularly. It's recording flight calls during the night. It's quite fascinating if you leave a recorder out all night and find out what sounds it can pick up. And people finding lots of odd birds flying over even urban areas. And birds you don't expect to be migrants. So coots and moorhens and ducks and all sorts of things flying over. That's something you can actually try here. We're probably a little bit late now, but in migration periods is recording all night, see if you can find anything. And obviously there's a few migration hotspots around the world. Now, I don't think we're so lucky in India. Unfortunately, we certainly don't have quite the same coastal hotspots or hotspots for passerine migration like this. We do more for waders and wildfowl. But if you want a little more fun, you have a look at this particular list that we have here. This was from a place called Tadoussac in Quebec in Canada. And this is a migrant count. Not that this is the bird list, it looks quite good. A few flycatchers going through, quite impressive. Numbers of flycatchers, 80 vireos, that sounds nice. Not many swallows and martins, but a few, quite nice wide selection. Ooh, now it's a bit more exciting. Look at these thrushes. 800 waxwings, wow. This is really getting quite exciting, this watch. It's a nice variety. 700 siskins flying over. This is pretty fantastic. So most of these birds are migrants. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. Super ovenbirds, water thrush again, warblers. 72,000 Tennessee warblers. This is all migrating birds in one day. Wow, this is getting exciting. 50,000 redstarts, 100,000 Cape May warblers, 100,000 magnolias, 144,000 bay-breasted warblers. Look at these totals. 72,000 yellow-rumped warblers. This was most of a day list. I think it's 8, 9, 10 hours that recorded more than 700,000 migrating warblers. So that's the sort of things you can be lucky enough once in a lifetime to observe. So if you are observing like that and you're recording all your data, we can do a lot with it together. So that was one checklist, but if everyone's recording checklists like this, this is something that Cornell put together. And this is a map of migrating birds in the Americas. Every dot on the map is a different species. The location of it is sort of averaged for that species for each day of the year. So you can see where these birds are migrating. So this is 118 species migrating throughout the year. There you go, starting spring migration, moving up through Central America into the States, a lot going over the Gulf of Mexico, and then going west, most of them into Canada, going way north somewhere. And then back in the autumn, funneling back through, some of them, look at those going over the Caribbean, and lots through Central America, and some going right down to South America. So you can start to see some of these things. So that's rather a lot about migration. Now to the interesting bits, I think, which is talking about some particular species. So I'll go through a few species that we have here. The Arctic tern that we talked about first of all. So the Arctic tern breeds across the Arctic. It winters across the Antarctic. So we're breeding various areas up here. We're wintering all around Antarctica. And these are the routes that some birds who attract is taking. And this journey for each Arctic tern, round trip, is at least 35,000 kilometers each year. But one bird was tagged in the UK in July, around about here. and it was in Antarctica in November. And by the time it returned to the breeding grounds the following summer, it had done 96,000 kilometers. So that's twice the circumference of the planet. And these are birds that actually, they're getting to Antarctica, they're then doing huge distances in Antarctica. So they're going right around. Some of the UK birds were tracked to go to New Zealand and then beyond and down to eastern Antarctica. In the spring, they're taking a slightly different route here, taking advantage of the currents and the winds, and took less than half the time, the migration in the spring. So it was about 40 days, I think, in the spring compared to closer to 100 days in the autumn. But ringing has shown that the oldest Arctic tern, I think, was 33 years old. So if you think it's done 35,000 kilometers, at least, for 33 years. So that's 1 million kilometers, at least, yearly. And it may have done 3 times as much as that, which would be about the same as going to the moon and back 4 times. Bar-tailed Godwit, the other big record breaker, breeds across the Arctic. Yeah, you can see the range of breeding. It actually breeds across all of Europe and Asia as well. But these are the particularly long distance migrant population, the Alaskan birds here. So one of the Alaskan breeders was satellite tagged to come straight across the Pacific Ocean, wintered in New Zealand, and did that journey non-stop, 11,680 kilometers in 8 days. And didn't stop once. So that's at 60 kilometers. Fantastic, fantastic story. What's almost as impressive is its spring migration. So in the spring, this particular bird from New Zealand is going to, this is the LOC, this area, as a staging site where it's spent several weeks, but it's done this journey in one go. And this is still 10,000 kilometers. And that was about a week's journey. So you can see the importance of a place like the LOC for migrants such as Bar-tailed Godwit and many other species. Ruby-throated Hummingbird. This lovely animation from Cornell shows the migration, majorly based on eBird data. So this bird weighs 3 grams. If you're lucky enough to see a hummingbird, 3 grams. And they migrate quite large distances from eastern North America through to Central America, southern Mexico. But some of these are flying over the Gulf of Mexico. If you watch the darkest color here, it sort of leaps across from here to here. So these are birds, tiny birds of 3 grams that are doing 1,000 kilometers over the Gulf of Mexico. And that's in maybe, even close to 24 hours, 20 hours of non-stop flying to get across there. Okay, move a bit closer to home, shall we? The species, anyway. Common cuckoos had quite a few different satellite tracking projects, so it's particularly interesting in recent years. Europe and Africa. This map is showing some birds that were tagged on their breeding grounds in Britain. And it's found they take 2 routes, but they end up in more or less the same small area of the Congo Basin in Africa. And it's found in those 2 routes that actually there were more fatalities coming from birds on the western route. So why is that? Well, maybe there's things like stopover sites are suffering. But it did show importance. There was actually in part of this period a very strong drought in Spain, which would have been part of the reason. Also, it's known in the breeding populations that western birds tended to take the west route, eastern birds east route. The western birds suffered because of feeding conditions were not so good. So maybe they just weren't as well prepared. And some of you may have seen in the news very recently, one of these cuckoos, which was a satellite tracked one, which just did the return journey back, wintering around here. It staged somewhere over the Ivory Coast, but from the Ivory Coast to East England, it came back 7,500 kilometers in 7 days, more than 1,000 kilometers a day. So if you look at cuckoos across the whole range. A few of these animations put together by Ashwin Vishwanathan of Bird Count India, which are great for, these are entirely based on eBird data. So this shows you what you can get if you're all contributing your data. So you can see here, we see the African, the European African ones. There's not so many records, but then they fill up here, fill up into Europe, and then they're coming back down. We can see, you can't really see the routes. There's not so much data here. There's not many people birding in lots of these parts of Africa. So satellite tagging has told us something, but not a lot from birders' data. However, when we come over to India, there is a little bit more. And it's interesting that cuckoos in North and East China, where they breed, around this area, it's filling in now, no one knew where they wintered. A lot of people thought they wintered in Southeast Asia. Some people thought they wintered in India. Some thought they might winter in Africa. So there's been a couple of projects in recent years tagging birds, the Beijing Cuckoo Project and the Mongolian Cuckoo Project, and they've proved where these birds are actually going. But even without that, I think you can probably tell from this map, if you look at all these birds that are here, and then there seems to be a bit of a filling up in India, and then there's quite a lot of birds filling up in Eastern Africa. Surely it looks like birds probably go to Africa. And sorry, I've got one more slide there, which I don't have, but sorry, this is actually on the globe here, are the tracked birds from Mongolia and from Beijing. And yes, clearly they do. These birds are crossing North India in this case, although we get lots of records in the south, and they're going across into Africa. And again, very recently, you might have seen some news of birds that have just come back, having left Ethiopia and Somalia, Kenya, I think, and have appeared in West Bengal and Bangladesh, doing about 4,000 kilometers in 5-6 days. One slightly closer to home, and this shows you what some of the lovely animations can do. This is something that Madhu put together a couple of years ago on pied cuckoo. So pied cuckoos are often known as the herald of the monsoon. So this is attempting to see, does the spread of pied cuckoos follow the monsoon? So the red here is the range of pied cuckoos from eBird records. The green is showing the monsoon. And the red range is based on where the furthest birds are getting. So it keeps expanding up. And it's quite impressive. They do more or less track each other. So, nice example. Okay, this one I think is probably my favorite. Northern wheatear, if you're birding in Europe, it's very often the first migrant you see in the spring, and you look forward to them. We know within days sometimes when they should be here, so you're looking out for them. It's an amazing passerine, and it's a real record breaker. So it breeds throughout Northern Europe and Asia, all the way across Asia, and across into Alaska. East. In the west side, it breeds through Greenland, and it breeds into Canada. So it actually breeds in Canada, both in the west of Canada and the east of Canada. Now you think that birds in Canada, here in Greenland, would migrate to the US, like all those birds we saw on the Cornell animation. But they don't. The entire population, both populations, migrate to Africa. So these birds in the west of their overall range are migrating across the North Sea and migrating down into sub-Saharan Africa. The birds in the east, in Alaska, coming across Asia, through Central Asia, down through the Middle East, and they're going to Africa. That is the longest migration of any songbird. So known to be about 14,500 kilometers one way. So you've got these birds doing the longest migration of any songbird, and you've got these birds over here doing the longest transoceanic flight. Pretty remarkable bird, northern wheatear. Amur falcons. Of course, I think most of us have probably heard the story of the Amur falcons, but it's shown very nicely on this animation. Again, if you see the animation, there's breeding areas here. Okay, now as we get to the autumn, look at they're all strengthening here, and then through to South India, and then Southwest. There's a period where there's a big concentration in Northeast India, and that's predominantly Nagaland, the Doyang Reservoir. which probably has 1 million amur falcons, the largest congregation of raptors anywhere in the world. But again, brilliantly showed on the animation. You see which route those are doing. So this, again, these birds from India here are suddenly appearing in East Africa. That's the longest sea crossing of any raptor. I mentioned before that most of the raptors avoid sea crossings. Falcons, not quite so much, but it's the largest raptors, the eagles, the buzzards, have to because they soar much more. Falcons are active flyers, so the amur falcon can do that journey. And a lot of this journey it does following migrating dragonflies for food as well. So I won't go into the story of amur falcons in Nagaland, but I'm sure you're aware that it was estimated that well over 100,000, 120, 140,000 were being killed each year and hunted. And thanks to some fantastic work by Conservation India and local NGOs, that's completely stopped. And it now becomes the amur falcons in October, November in Nagaland is really one of the migration spectacles of the whole world. Okay. Right, I don't know how many people, I didn't check the messages, how many people got this right for those who were early on this call. That map I showed then was peregrine falcon. So these are, again, satellite tagged birds, tagged in 3 different areas in the Russian tundra. And I find this fascinating that they've all, the 3 areas, one in the west, one center, one east. The west birds have all gone west, central birds have all gone to the south, eastern birds have all gone to the east. They've all gone very directly. There's no real meandering routes particularly. And this shows you, these are where our Indian peregrines are coming from. So we're used to the resident peregrine, the Shaheen, but the peregrines we see in the winter, which come right down to the southern tip of India, they're coming from here. And again, if you look at the distances here, India looks tiny compared to the distances these birds are traveling. So these are tundra peregrines that we're seeing in the winter, some of these 6,000 to 7,000 kilometers one way, which actually globally is quite short for peregrines. So peregrines in the Americas go from North America down to Southern America, maybe 25,000 kilometers round trip. So interesting one. I haven't got the eBird map for this, but if you're seeing peregrines, it's well worth recording whether you're seeing a Shaheen, resident peregrine, or a migrant peregrine, the Calidas ones, if you can tell, because then maybe we could see some of these sort of tracks through. Bar-headed goose we talked about. So I mentioned their migration through the Himalayas. Clearly there's not much oxygen altitude, so it's a difficult migration. So tagged birds have shown to hug the land as much as possible. So they fly through the valleys, through the passes. So they're using the saving energy as much as they can. And that means they rise and fall a lot. You can imagine these flocks of bar-headed goose rising up with the wind in places, dropping down other places. So majority of their migration is not actually very high. So most birds weren't tracked above 6,000 meters, but they do go much higher. But it is thought that the over the top of Mount Everest probably didn't actually happen. Things the map shows here. There's a population in Europe, as you can see, that's birds that used to be captive and have escaped. So they migrate around a little bit in Europe. But the Indian birds, most birds are in India in winter. There's where they breed, in Mongolia, in China, in Tibet, some in India and Ladakh. But all the birds are coming into India in winter. And when they migrate back, there's a few breeding areas or stopover sites potentially here. So you could investigate and identify some sites that are probably important here. There's also probably molt migration happening with bar-headed geese. So some of these sites may be important for that, and maybe the lilac sites. Gargany, we'll talk about. So a slightly different one on Gargany, very common wintering duck. So this is from eBird. This is something anyone can produce. This is just straight off the eBird website. This is looking at the frequency of occurrence for Garganys in Karnataka and Kerala, where you can see that it's a winter visitor. There you go. But then there's another peak in the spring. So in March, they peak a little bit more. Maybe this is birds from south then passing through. So for example, they winter in Sri Lanka. This could be birds that are wintering in Sri Lanka that are coming through. Then they're gone. We don't get them in the summer at all. And they steadily increase through September, October onwards back to the wintering levels. But if you're in Delhi and Haryana, you don't have very many Garganys in the winter. There's a few, but it's very much a passage bird. So this is a passage migrant predominantly. And there's a big peak here, which corresponds with the peak that we see here as well. So birds are moving throughout the country at this time of year. And then in the autumn, you see a slower passage increase, but they drop down in winter. So one thing about garganese is it's known that the molt migration is different between males and females. They're a differential migrant. So males go off and molt about 1 month before females, typically. So we should expect to see males earlier than females here. Males arrive on the breeding grounds earlier. So are the first migrants males more than females? Don't know. But if people can record this information, start recording sexes when you can, we'd know. But there is one thing I've found out in Europe. There are studies that have realized that some garganese pair up in the winter, and then they migrate together. So they're not all differential migrants. Some of them may pair up like that. And interesting, that idea of pairing up, birds may have bred in different areas. They meet up in the winter, they pair up in the winter, and then they have to decide whether they head to where the male came from or where the female came from. And that's called ab-migration, that pairing up and then migrating together. I'm sure it won't surprise you to know that pretty much most cases, the males follow the females and they go where she tells them. Okay, now, Oriental pratincolt. Oriental pratincolt breeds in East and Southeast Asia, as we can see from here, where most of these. The vast majority of the global population winters in Northwest Australia. There was actually a count on one beach of 2.8 million birds. It was 80-mile beach, so it's presumably quite a big beach, but it's still vast majority of the population wintering here. In India, they're thought to be resident or a short distance migrant. And from this map, that probably makes sense. Indian birds are moving around in India a bit, breeding in parts, but breeding a bit further north probably, and then as you come back into the winter, probably moving a bit further south typically. Not a lot of pattern, but they're probably staying around here. Whereas Australian birds are probably heading up into forming this breeding population. So that was what's thought, and there was a lot of birds ringed, but I think only one recovery from Taiwan. Until last year, when 5 birds were tagged in Australia. They're tagged here. 4 of the tags survived, and these birds were tracked to Cambodia and Taiwan as expected. But then one bird left Thailand, as it was in, and it flew across to India. And from the satellite tags, they could tell this bird, which had ended up in North Karnataka, wasn't moving very far in the summer, and they suspected it could be breeding. So this is already pretty amazing. There's never been an Australasian shorebird confirmed for sure in India. So this was the first one. But because of the satellite signals, a team from Bangalore led by Subbu Subramania last year headed out to the area where the bird had been tagged and spent a few days there, and they found it. You see the yellow flag on its leg. So this bird was photographed by Subbu, is an Australian tagged bird where they actually found it on the breeding grounds in North Karnataka. Really must have been an amazing feeling to have found that bird. And it's now recently returned to India. So if we get lockdown lifted at some stage, we can go out and try and re-find it. It was in Orissa a few weeks back, I think. Rosy starling, we're all familiar with. Slightly different map that was put together for Migrant Watch by Bird Count India a few years ago. So rosy starling is a very slow migrant. So showing this in autumn, these black dots are birds that the first sighting was in July. So okay, they've arrived in Gujarat, so you can see how early they arrive after breeding in Central Asia. And then the colours show when the first birds were seen. So they're in July here, but it's August, September are the reds and the oranges, so it's taken a few months, and then it's the yellows and not really until November and even December time. So from July through to November, typically, it's taking them that long to get to South India. And you can see from their full range, again, this is through the autumn, most of them are in India. Then through May, they've all appeared in Central Asia, Eastern Europe particularly. Now they've started to come in July, and you can see actually that this is quite slow. They're filling up in India, but we're still November, December. They're all around, but it's taken them a long time to get down to southern India. So it's a slow return, a slow outward passage. Okay, finally, just do a few warblers, because I'm sure they're of most interest to everybody. We all like the little brown jobs. Lesser white throat. In this case, this is showing both the Kuruka subspecies group, and Humes is the red one, now treated by eBird as one species, but we have lots of records of at subspecies level. And there's a couple of things you can see from this map. In India, the distribution of the different lesser white throats wasn't really very well known, and still isn't by a lot of people. But you can see from here, when these birds now in the summer, there's the Humes breeding in Ladakh and into Central Asia a bit. When these birds start to come back, South India is red, and the rest of India is blue, or western half of India. There's very little blue in the extreme south, but they're all red. So we know that Humes is much more southerly in India than Lesser. Another very interesting thing about this particular map, so Lesser is breeding right into UK, is that these birds are going southeast. They're all coming really to India, few into East Africa, but none of these birds go south or west for some reason. And we talked about barriers before. The Mediterranean is a big barrier for lots of birds, so birds get funneled on the side. No birds get funneled down this western route, which is a major migration route. This is almost no dots in Spain or Portugal at all. It's an incredibly rare bird there, but it's really very common further north. So the birds are all going southeast. Southeast migrations again, greenish warbler here. We have two subspecies, one that breeds widely across Europe and Asia, and one that breeds in the Himalayas. Here we go, widely across Europe and Asia, some breeding here. In the winter, they're all piling into India. So almost all greenish warblers into India, some into Southeast Asia. And green, we'll just show green a little bit more. It's mostly around the Caucasus area, and some in Iran. It's exclusively Southwest India. So all the population going here. It's a shorter distance migrant, but all going southeast. So why these birds don't go into Africa at all? Maybe is an evolutionary thing, and so there's such an interesting thing with migrants is whether you consider them to be our birds because they winter with us, or are they the birds that are in summer grounds? They spend most of the time in the winter in grounds. So you could say these are Indian birds generally that have evolved migration strategies. So they've evolved to migrate further north, further west, but they come back on their same learned routes, which is why they're not in Africa. Maybe is one theory. Okay, there's two more I'm going to cover. This one is one of my favorites, and I'm including this for those who saw Martin Kelsey's excellent webinar on warblers. He mentioned how the migration for yellow-browed warbler has changed over years. And if you look at this map, it's a fascinating map. So in the winter now, you see a lot of yellow in the extremes of the range. If you see now, as they come into the breeding area, it's a very wide breeding area across part of Europe and Asia. Not so many records, not so many birders, but it fills up in the west and the east. And in the winter itself, there's a lot still here, and there's a lot here. So it's got two very distinct wintering populations in East Asia, where the bulk of them are, but this whole population in Europe, winter now in some parts of UK, Spain, Portugal, even off West Africa. And if you look at this map, this is the BirdLife International map of what they think the range is of yellow-browed warbler. And it makes sense, there's birds in the north, there's a passage in the middle, and there's a wintering area in the south. So this was what yellow-browed warbler was thought to do. And you can see from the records we've got on the eBird animation, how now they're really quite different. Final one for today. All these are worth looking at more, but we'll stick with Blythe-Reed warbler. Very familiar to most of us in India. The entire population winters in India and Sri Lanka. Again, straight from eBird, these two maps. Karnataka and Kerala, it's a common winter bird. A lot of us are seeing it in our gardens. Yeah? But they start leaving in end of March here, and they drop right down. And by May, early May, they're gone. None here at all until quite suddenly and quite late. There's a few records in September, but really not until mid-October here do they start to come back, and then they're back in force. Common bird in the winter. For you lot up in Delhi and Haryana, that's a very different picture. Yes, you might have a few winter records, there's a few hang on, but it's clearly a spring passage bird with a peak here. disappears again, and then very much an autumn passage bird. It's quite common, and there we are, October, a bit earlier for you than it reaches us in the south, but again drops off. There aren't very many in the winter. So some of you may have noticed we did a little experiment on Facebook in the last few days. We've been birding in lockdown. It means most of us have been thoroughly watching our gardens or our local areas where Blythe-Reed warbler is quite regular. So as an example, I've seen Blythe-Reed warbler most days through March and April. And I saw my last one on the 16th of April. So because I've been watching regularly in my area, I know that it left roughly around then. So we asked a few people, wherever they were in India, to also say the same for where they were, if they've been watching regularly. And out of 5 or 6 people in Bangalore, interestingly, those people who watched regularly, so most days they've been watching, their Blythe-Reed warblers last date was all between the 13th and the 20th. This light blue strip here. That was the last time we all recorded our Blythe-Reed warblers here. And it follows. It's in the, this graph otherwise shows all years, all records. So it's in the period we expect them to be more or less gone. Now in Delhi, slightly different. I don't have so many people answered, but it's interestingly that the first records, so the green patch is when people have seen them in Delhi. The green patch here corresponds to, again, most of them have left in the south, and they spent a little bit longer here. So they're spent maybe up to a month so far. So they're presumably stopping in passage. And whether they continue past today or not, we don't know. But again, it corresponds very closely with the average peak over the last few years, this period where they weren't around left of the screen bar. So brilliant bird, Blythe-Reed warblers, one we can all watch and record. Okay, finally, this was just new from yesterday, this fantastic animation posted by Madhu. This shows Blythe-Reed warblers. There's a nice singing Blythe-Reed warbler. This is Blythe-Reed warblers throughout Europe and Asia. In winter, they're all in India, and then they race up as you can see as the fish appears as light numbers, and they're back in India again. Watch them as they go through. All moving out, spreading out into Sweden, Finland, where they're singing like this bird is singing here, and then they're back in India. Brilliant animation, all from eBird records, and a bit of London genius to put it together nicely. So unfortunately, we don't get them singing quite this long, but they're an interesting song as well. So there's a lot of mimicry going on here. But it's singing bits of common white-throat and bits of blackbird and bits of even European nightjar, a bit song. Okay, so not certain, still can, but one of the most interesting to watch and study tonight. So that's where I'd like to end that. But we've got a little quiz going on. There's a little Zeiss are giving you a little prize for anyone who can answer my question, or the best person to answer my question. I think some of these interesting migrants are birds that you don't really think of as being true migrants. The Bar-tailed Godwits are fantastic, but it's some of the lesser known ones where eBird data is now showing us things. And I could have talked about lots like Indian pitta, for example. That's a migrant. The shorter distance migrants, verditer flycatcher, maybe Indian golden orioles, forest wagtail, even house sparrow. A lot of these we don't know very well, but are particularly interesting. So the question is, what is the most interesting mystery migrant in India, and why, in your opinion? And the prize will go to the answer I like best, or one randomly from the good answers. So you can go to that URL and tell us how long it's going to Nick will tell us in a minute. But in the meantime, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. That was so nice, and that was very informative and an interesting talk about the various kinds of migrants, the when, how, and why of migration, and also about throwing light on what triggers the need to migrate and how they navigate the very complex journeys. Also, the migrant coil behind you was very aptly listening to your call and calling in every now and then. So hopefully now people will not use the term bird brain, and as birds we know have such complex brains way beyond the comprehension. So we'll now take in any questions that anybody has. So Kavi, any questions?
Yep, so we got a couple of questions in the chat during the talk. I'll ask them one by one to Mike. The first question is by Ashish Gupta, where he's asking that there seem to be several species following the northwest to southeast route from Europe to India. Would this not qualify as a separate major flyway?
That's a very good question, actually. And,
Mike, sorry. Mike, if you put your screen off, then we can see your face bigger.
Yeah.
That'd be nice.
Hang on.
No, I meant if you stop sharing your screen.
My share is gone. There we are. Okay, come back.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's an extremely good question, and I agree, it's true actually. I think part of this has become the flyaway idea came predominantly from waders. So it's very much dominated by wader migration. And then it's been generalized by BirdLife International to identify these major routes. But clearly birds don't just migrate in these routes. And I think you see, especially for passerines, that a lot of them really don't. So they cross flyways. But even ignoring passerines, even the waders, they do cross these flyways. It's less saying that birds all go in these routes, but more a way of identifying key major areas where birds migrate through, and therefore ones where we should be cooperating with other countries and identifying staging sites for conservation. That's one of the big difficulty. You can protect the habitats and the most fantastic habitats in India, and we can do a brilliant job. Whether we are or not is debatable, but we could preserve all these habitats fantastically ourselves. It's not much good if the birds are going off to breeding grounds which are disappearing and they need to stage outside of India, and the staging sites, the habitats is being destroyed. So they're a guide, but yeah, for passerines, I agree that lots of them don't really follow those flyways. Yep. I think probably had they come up with the flyways idea from scratch, they probably would have recorded a northwest to southeast flyway for all the birds that winter in India.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Mike. I think with more data being collected through eBird, I think more flyways are going to be easier to identify. The next question is from Rajesh Dubey, who's asking that if birds are migrating at night and resting during the day, are they easy prey for predators? If so, how do birds avoid that?
It depends, yes, possibly. I mean, the birds are resting up during the day, so I think birds generally, when they're resting and they're roosting overnight in places are not necessarily attractive. They're deep in the bushes or resting there, or if they're waders, they're roosting out on mud flats and high tide roosts, which are generally protected. But yeah, there is a possibility, and of course, that's part of the problem that bad weather causes, with birds having to stop during the day when they're not fully prepared. They may not be resting in the areas that they would have wanted to rest in. They may be attractive prey. And I'm sure the stopover sites, of course, if you look at a stopover site for waders, you're probably going to find quite a few peregrines there. So the stopover sites do attract predators. Probably the biggest predator, maybe not so much in India, but in the US, you've seen these 5 billion birds they showed on the maps. The biggest predator there is cats. Absolutely, so domestic cats. So these birds are roosting there, stopping in gardens or places like that overnight. I think they reckon something like 2 billion birds a year are killed by cats. So yes, birds on migration are definitely a risk for predators.
Yep. Okay, so another question that we have is from JVD Murthy, who's asking that with reports of the Earth's magnetic pole shifting towards Siberia, what possible implications could it have on migratory routes or birds?
That's a good one. Well, I assume that the shift is not actually that drastic, so it's not going to change them too much. I would have thought that it probably makes fairly little difference, because if you think most of the journey is orientation, is a bit approximate. So I don't think the shift is going to change things so drastically. And we imagine that navigating, when they're coming down to more precise locations, they're also then using landmarks and so the rivers, the coastlines and things a little bit more. So without personally understanding how drastic the shift is, I don't imagine it would make much of a difference.
Okay. Another question that's coming from Dipankar is, what is the role of tailwinds in terms of migration? Is flight pattern dependent on tailwind? And I think another question he's asking is how climate change is hampering bird migration.
So tailwinds, yes, they do. In fact, birds like to set off with a small tailwind. I think generally birds will want to avoid the really strong wind. So birds don't necessarily migrate or want to be migrating when there's a very strong tailwind. But light tailwinds definitely help, and the energy requirement is much less. So they do help, but wind, of course, also is what pushes birds off course quite a lot. In parts of the world, are extremely helpful, but not. In terms of climate change, yes. So I mean, obviously there are impacts. So you could say there's some positive impacts if you looked at the map of how the northern Siberia and things is opening up with extra vegetation and things like that. There are more areas, so you could say there's some positives in that there might be more habitats there. But equally, a lot of birds in the more southern areas will be struggling with the same habitat change. You are seeing birds spreading northwards more, so breeding populations of birds have moved north, typically with a lot of species. Worth keeping good notes for that. There are a lot of people studying the impact of climate change on birds generally, not just migration.
Mm-hmm. Maitra is asking a question which is quite similar to this one, but he's asking that any species in India, do we know of any species in India that have changed their migration routes in response to climate change?
I don't know. I don't know. I would have thought there may well be in some of the Himalayan birds, which maybe have changed their ranges a bit. Something that some people have been studying. So if anyone knows of anything, might be helpful to send it in a chat or email me or something, and I can look into it. I can maybe circulate. But very interesting question, and quite possibly.
Okay, we have a question from Jaswinder, who's asking, what do we know about the local migration pattern of resident raptors, such as lagger falcon, Bonelli's eagle, and crested serpent eagle?
I don't think we know very much at all about them, is the answer. Some of these I wouldn't think are particularly migratory. So Bonelli's eagle, for example, I doubt is particularly migratory. It's not a bird that's seen much in some of the major raptor migration watch points. So for example, Eilat in Israel, Batumi in Georgia, I mentioned, and that's where some of the videos and the photos of European honey buzzers were from. Don't particularly record Bonelli's eagles in large numbers. Thailand is another area, it's large raptor migration. Juveniles wander, there's probably some dispersal, but I doubt there's very much there. Lagger falcon, again, is fairly resident. There may be some local migration. We know the ranges have contracted for probably other reasons. A lot of Indian species, I think, that are not clearly 100% migratory, but may well have migratory populations. And some of these could well be the same. It would be well worth, now we all have access to eBird data, is looking at some of these maps and some of these graphs like I have done. I think they tend to produce more questions than answers, but it's something that we can all look at these days.
Yes, of course. Another interesting question that we've got from Sharang is, would a migratory bird that's been born in captivity still have the same migratory instincts as wild ones?
Yes, they do. There's a lot of the tests early on orientation were done that on birds in captivity. And yes, they do. I think there was some studies done on garden warblers, so that more European and West Asian breeder that migrates to Africa. And some were certainly hand-reared completely, but still showed migratory tendencies in the autumn. They still tried to orient themselves in the direction they went. And in one case, there was one study I know which it was known that during the migration period, so if they're migrating between August and October, say, they would orient themselves differently halfway through that period, to shift their directions a little bit. And that apparently corresponded with a sort of route change they typically take. They don't take a direct route, they take a slightly angled route, probably passing certain staging sites. So yeah, absolutely, they do all have an instinctive knowledge of migration and where and when to migrate.
Okay. Maybe we just take a couple more questions. This one's from Joanna, who's asking, do full bird molts always coincide with breeding periods?
Well, molt is very variable in lots of birds, but typically birds, most passerines will have a full molt before breeding, full molt after breeding, sorry. And juveniles, who just bred, will have a partial molt because they've got very poor quality feathers when they're hatched. So they'll migrate quite quickly afterwards. But then it varies. So passerines generally will have molted before they migrate. Waders generally not so much. So we see a lot of, if you look at waders in the autumn, you'll see lots of juvenile plumage, really smart, nice marked fringes on ruffs and things like that that are juvenile. So they're migrating in juvenile plumage. Pipits, you know, Rabbit mentioned pipits recently. We don't ever see pipits of Richard's pipit or Bly's pipit or the migratory ones in juvenile plumage in India. They all migrate before then. You might see them in first winter plumage. They've still got some feathers. There are birds that will start migrating and then start molting and then pause it for migration. There's some birds that will molt during migration as well. So there's a whole load of different strategies. And interestingly, when birds arrive in the winter and they have their molt before they leave again, some birds molt when they first arrive, some birds molt when just before they leave, and some birds do it very gradually throughout. Definitely a few webinars on molt in there, I think.
Yep, maybe that's the last question for the day. This one's from Kajal, who's asking, do high pollution levels, somewhat similar to what we had in Delhi last year, affect or delay the arrival of migratory birds?
I don't know for sure, but yes, I'm guessing they would. So things like, I mean, in general, not necessarily pollution, but cloud and fog disorients birds or can stop them migrating and delay them. Whether, for example, Delhi pollution and smog, it's a little bit later happening, so birds have finished their autumn migration. Whether if the main pollution period was moving a bit earlier in the autumn, was hitting earlier in November and October, whether that would have much of an impact, I don't know. Pollution is obviously a big problem with things like some of the staging areas. So the Yellow Sea that we described, there's a lot of industrial activity there. So you can imagine if some kind of pollution mishap actually happened, oil spills or things like that in areas where staging, they can have a huge drastic effect. That's probably the biggest issue with pollution would be at staging areas where there could be a huge wipeout of populations.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Nikesh, saying maybe we can take one or two more questions as some people have posted a few more questions here. This one's from Puneet, who's asking, does the full moon affect the time of migration, especially when birds are migrating at night?
I think, I mean, yes, when birds migration is timed around their molt or the other way around, whichever way you see it. So yes, I explained some of the variations, but typically birds want their feathers to be in prime condition before migration. So that's what influences them. And I mentioned there's sort of three main phases in a bird's year, if you like, that take all their energy, and that's breeding, and that's molt, and that's migration. But those are all staged so that they don't generally overlap.
Okay. This question's from Bharti, who's asking, if a species migratory routes turn into conflict zones, do they change their routes?
Well, I think probably they can't at such short notice, and this is why you see big issues with hunting over so raptor passage. This is why the Siberian crane is no longer found in India, because presumably hunting through Afghanistan, Pakistan maybe is what killed off the last remaining part of that population. I don't think the bird would be able to adapt clearly enough in that way, so I doubt it.
Okay. Last question for the day. This one's from Gautama, who's asking that do different species of birds migrate together without conflict, like without conflict amongst the different species?
That's a good question. Yes, I mean, so certain species do migrate together. I think most studies have found that birds don't necessarily stick together. So it's not like they're picking a partner for the journey and doing the entire journey together. There are birds that do in family groups, and that's within species, but most mixed species, the waders that we talked about, are often found in mixed flocks. You'll find several species together in a flock because they're doing more or less the same routes. They're using the more or less the same staging areas. They're using the same sort of feeding areas. Warblers, we'll look at the eBird list that I showed, and you see the variety of species there. So all these species, the conditions are right for them to migrate, so they'll all migrate together. And there isn't really any competition, particularly from them. Certainly not during migration. There may be for food at some sites, but I say typically there isn't competition, because competition more from birds is going to be majorly around breeding territories and when they're nesting, and I suppose when there's a shortage of food, probably the main conflict areas likely to have. So less so on migration, and many species happily migrate together.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. I think that's the last question. Over to you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That was really, really fascinating. And thank you, everybody, for joining in. And we'll see you next weekend now. Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.